The sound that changed Garrett Hayes' life wasn't a gunshot. It was the scrape of a chain on dry Arizona dirt. He'd come to Crow's Landing for simple things: salt, horseshoes, canvas, things a man could touch and measure, things that didn't talk back. The sun was high and mean, bleaching the color from the sky, and the settlement baked in the heat. Men leaned on porch rails, faces burned dark by sun and whiskey, their eyes holding the kind of lazy cruelty that made Garrett's hand itch for a gun he no longer carried. A dog snapped at flies in the dust. He kept his head down, the old scar on his neck pulling tight under his kerchief. 5 years. 5 years since they tried to hang him for a crime he didn't commit, for a choice he'd make again in a heartbeat. He was almost to the trading post when he heard it. That drag of metal, that murmur of men's voices, punctuated by a kind of laughter that turned his stomach sour. The kind of laughter that comes before blood. Around the side of the building, a crowd had gathered. Maybe 20 men, maybe more, forming a loose, hungry circle near the livestock pens. Garrett knew he should walk away. Get his supplies, keep his head down, disappear back into the canyons where the world made more sense. But his feet wouldn't obey. They carried him forward, pulled by the same damned instinct that had earned him that rope around his neck at a place called Bear Creek. The men shifted as he got closer, just enough for him to see inside the circle. And what he saw stopped him cold. She stood between two iron posts, chains biting into the flesh of her wrists, linking her to metal rings. She was tall, taller than most of the men gawking at her, with broad shoulders and strong limbs that spoke of a life lived under the open sky. Her buckskin dress was torn, ripped at the shoulder and high on one thigh, showing skin covered in a sheen of sweat and dust. A raw red X had been burned into her left shoulder. The skin was still angry and blistered, a mark of ownership made with fire and pain. But it was her eyes that hit him, dark, steady, and utterly, completely unbroken. She didn't beg. She didn't cower. She stared straight ahead, right through the men, as if they were nothing more than ghosts, nothing more than shadows in the dust. A man on a wooden crate held a ledger. His voice was practiced, slick with the casual cruelty of a man who sells living things for a living. "Unfit for womanly use," he called out, his words echoing in the hot, still air. "Too big to breed, not claimed by any authority, sold as meat to recover losses." Laughter rippled through the crowd. A few men tossed coins onto the crate, not real bids, just mockery. A butcher in a blood-stained apron stepped forward, his eyes clinical, already calculating cuts of flesh, his hand resting on the hilt of a long knife at his belt. Garrett's stomach clenched. He'd seen this before. He'd seen it in the war, seen it on the plains. The moment men decide another person is no longer human. His hand went to his neck, to the rope scar hidden beneath the cloth. The auctioneer raised his hands, a showman playing to his crowd. "No bids. Then we settle the matter with a knife." The butcher smiled. He patted the blade at his belt, and Garrett stepped forward. Not too fast, not too slow. Just a man moving with purpose. He placed his satchel on the top rail of the fence. He took out a battered ledger, a folded sheet of paper with official-looking script, and a dull brass seal with an eagle stamped into it. He set the ledger flat on the rail, the paper on top, and placed the seal on the corner. "Federal Contract Review," he said, his voice calm and even, cutting through the noise. "This person is listed under protective custody for transport irregularities. Confiscated from improper sale pending inspection. I'll sign her out and file it." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He just used the words. The words that made small men picture soldiers and signatures and hard questions asked later by people with time and paper and the power to make lives difficult. The auctioneer's practiced smile faltered. And that's when Garrett saw his face clearly for the very first time. Ice slid down his spine. Morris Fletcher. Older now, heavier, his beard shot through with gray. But it was him, the man who had ordered the massacre at Bear Creek. The man who had sentenced Garrett to hang for refusing to fire on unarmed civilians. The man whose lies had branded him a traitor and left him with a scar that still burned in his dreams. Fletcher's eyes narrowed. Recognition dawned. For a single stretched-out heartbeat, Garrett thought it was over, that Fletcher would call him out, expose the lie. But then Fletcher's lips curved into a cold, thin smile. "Well now," he said, his voice quiet, too low for the crowd to hear. "Still saving Indians, Hayes? Didn't learn your lesson the first time." Garrett kept his face a mask of stone. "Papers are in order," he said, tapping the ledger. "Federal jurisdiction supersedes local claim." Fletcher's smile didn't waver. It wasn't a smile of amusement. It was a smile that promised pain. "Take her then," he whispered. "You'll see me again." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Garrett moved to the post. He lifted the heavy chain from the hook, wrapping the slack around his forearm so it wouldn't drag in the dirt. He was careful to keep a small space between himself and the woman. He didn't touch her skin. He didn't push. "Walk," he said in the same tone he used for a mule he respected. And she moved when he moved. They passed through the gate, the crowd parting just enough, their whispers like the hiss of snakes in dry grass. Someone spat and missed. The chain rattled once against the rail, a final metallic sigh, and then went quiet. The woman's breathing stayed level, a steady rhythm in the suffocating silence. Garrett's heart pounded in his throat, a frantic drum against his ribs, but he kept his eyes forward, focused on the weathered side of his wagon. Outside the yard, the wind was cooler. A dog barked near a far shed. His mule lifted its head and snorted, sensing his approach. He stopped beside the wagon tongue and turned to her, really seeing her up close for the first time. The brand on her shoulder was worse than he'd thought. The skin was split and blistering, angry red against her dark skin. A flare of hot anger burned in his chest, but he kept it locked behind his teeth. He nodded at the wagon bed. "Water," he said, pointing to the barrel. He kept his movements slow, deliberate. She watched his hands. Then she watched his eyes. She saw no mockery there. She saw no man trying to own her. She saw a man whose jaw went tight and hard when he looked at the burn on her shoulder. She stepped to the barrel. She drank in long, steady pulls. Not fast, not greedy. Just a woman quenching a fire in her throat. She set the dipper down without a clatter. She didn't thank him. She didn't owe him that, and he didn't expect it. Two clerks from the store came out and stood on the porch, their arms crossed, watching. Fletcher lingered by the gate to the pens, pretending to count a coil of rope, but Garrett felt his eyes on them, hot and heavy. Garrett opened his own ledger. He wrote his name, the date, and a short, official-sounding line about irregular custody. He pressed the brass seal into the page, leaving a faint impression of an eagle. He left the book open on the wagon seat so anyone who cared enough to look could read the lie. He looked at the woman again. "I drive out now," he said. "You can walk beside the wagon. It's 8 miles to a shack." He paused, letting the words settle. "Better than here." He waited. She didn't answer. Whether she had English or not didn't matter yet. She looked at the road stretching out into the Badlands. She looked back at Fletcher, who was still watching from the porch. She looked at the butcher, who was cleaning his knife on his apron. Then she gave a single, sharp nod. Garrett set the chain across the wagon bed out of sight. He untied the mule, checked the left rear shoe that was starting to come loose, and decided it would hold. He climbed to the seat, took the reins, and clicked his tongue. He didn't tell her to keep up. He had eyes. He knew her legs were long and her lungs were good. He knew she was a survivor. As the wheels began to turn, he took a quick inventory. One mule, one wagon, a half-full barrel of water, a sack of cornmeal, 2 blankets, a small jar of bear grease for wounds, a cold stove at home, and a person who had been sold as meat walking beside him without asking a single question about what came next. He felt the weight of that choice settle across his shoulders, heavy and real, the way a pack sits after the first hard mile. But he didn't regret it. The regret would have been in leaving her there. That was a weight he knew he couldn't carry. He looked at her as they cleared the last shed of Crow's Landing. "My name is Garrett," he said, his voice level. "I haul freight. I fix tools. I don't sell people." Her dark, steady eyes held on his. She said nothing, but her face told him everything he needed to know. Fear held down by a will of iron. Stress tucked into the tight muscles of her jaw. A thin, humming thread of readiness for pain. And under it all, a small, guarded question. What does this man want? He let the question hang in the dry air between them. He wouldn't answer it with talk. He'd answer it by what he did next. They took the wagon track that led toward the canyon badlands. Crow's Landing and its casual cruelty fell away behind them. The wind pushed dust low across the ground, and the sun began its slow slide toward the ridges. Garrett kept the mule at a steady ground-eating walk. He watched the trail ahead and the trail behind, scanning for any fresh sign of riders. He kept his ledger and the brass seal near his knee, just in case someone tried to stop them and ask for proof of his lie. He planned the first hour, get some distance from the post, make the slow climb to the wash, no fire until it was full dark. He planned the night, a clean cloth and bear grease for her shoulder, food simple and hot. He'd take the bedroll by the door, his back to the wall, his tools where his hands could find them in the dark. He thought about why he was here, in this exact moment. Not the easy answer of salt and horseshoes, the real one. Since the war, he'd told himself his only job was to keep the road clear for goods and people who meant no harm. He had worked to make that true. He had walked away from fights that would settle themselves. He had stepped into the ones that would not. Today had been one of those. The woman walked with her eyes forward. The burn on her shoulder ached, a deep, throbbing fire. The skin under the torn dress stung where dust stuck to sweat. Her legs felt strong. Her stomach was empty. Her throat was better. She did her own quiet inventory. Wrists cut from the chains, but not bleeding badly. Shoulder burned, but not infected yet. Feet sore, but holding up. Head clear. She tried to picture the road ahead, but she did not know this land. She did not know this man. She knew only this. The chain was not pulling her. The butcher's knife was behind her. The man beside the wagon had looked at her, had seen her, and had chosen to move her away from a bad end. For the next mile, that was enough. They did not speak again before they reached the ridge. They did not need to. The tasks were clear. His mission was to get them clear of the post without a fight and to keep her alive through the first night. Her mission was to stay on her feet, to keep her breath steady, and to not show a single moment of weakness to anyone who might be following them. She kept pace with the wagon. He kept the mule from stumbling on the loose rock. The wind dropped. The sound of the wheels on the hard-packed ground filled the space where words might have been. At the top of the rise, Garrett glanced back. No riders. No dust plume against the setting sun. He let out a single, slow breath, but he did not let his shoulders drop. He had learned a long time ago not to trust the quiet stretches. He pointed ahead, to a dark cut in the land where the wash ran when it rained. "Another hour," he said, "then shelter." She nodded once, the same sharp, single movement she had made in the yard. Her face barely changed, but he saw it, a small release at the edges of her mouth, a slight easing in her eyes. Not relief, not yet, just a mark on the inside of her own mental ledger. The man said shelter, and he knew where it was. They went on. The sun lowered. The air cooled. The first coyote called from a far slope, a lonely, haunting sound. Garrett steadied the reins and set his jaw. The woman matched the turn of the wagon wheel and kept walking. Both of them understood the work in front of them. Both of them understood that what mattered now was simple. Keep moving, get inside a door, and close it against the world. The sun had slipped low behind the ridges by the time the wagon reached the cut in the land where the wash ran in wet seasons. Shadows stretched long over rock and brittle grass. Garrett guided the mule off the main track onto a narrow trail that curved behind a cluster of shale outcrops, hidden from the open flats. He did not speak, and neither did she. Her breathing was even, but he saw how her stride shortened when the ground turned rough. He made a note of it without comment. The shack came into view near full dark. It wasn't much. One room, plank walls grayed by years of wind, a stone chimney leaning but holding. At one end, a small lean-to that sagged but kept its shape. The roof was sound enough. He'd patched it last spring when he'd used the place as a stopover on wheat runs. He pulled the mule up near the trough and unhitched the traces, rubbing the animal down quick before looping the reins over a post. The water barrel was half full, good enough for tonight. He dipped a cup and handed it to her first. She drank without spilling, though her hands shook just a little when she passed the cup back. He saw it. He said nothing. He pushed the door open with his shoulder and struck a match inside. The small flame showed a single room, a rough table, 2 chairs, an iron stove in the corner. His bedroll was on the floor, and a shelf held a few tin plates and a sack of cornmeal. No bed, no frills, just shelter. He watched her eyes travel the space. No fear, no relief, just the steady, measuring look of someone making a map in her head. She stayed near the door until he moved to the stove, knelt, and began setting kindling under the grate. When the first small flames took hold, the room brightened. The smell of cold ash gave way to smoke and heat. Garrett dropped his coat on a chair and reached for a pot. "Sit," he said. Not an order, just a word with room in it. She sat on the bench against the far wall, her hands resting on her knees. The slack from the chain was still wrapped around her forearm. He hadn't taken it off yet. One thing at a time. He set the pot on the stove, poured in water, and added a handful of beans and a strip of salt pork. As the water began to hiss, he spoke for the first time since the ridge. "There's food, won't be fast." He didn't look up, didn't crowd her with his eyes. She didn't answer, but she shifted slowly, as if the stiffness in her legs was speaking louder than words. While the pot simmered, he brought a tin basin and set it on the table. He filled it with water, warm from the kettle on the stove. He placed a folded clean cloth beside it and nodded toward her shoulder. "Burn needs cleaning." She froze. Her jaw went tight. She looked at the basin, then at him, her eyes guarded. He didn't move closer. He just said, "Do it yourself if you'd rather." He turned back to the stove, keeping his hands busy with a skillet, giving her the space. When he glanced again, she was carefully rolling the torn buckskin strap down, bearing the raw, red X on her skin. The flesh was swollen, shiny with raw heat. She dipped the cloth, her hands steady, and pressed it against the burn. She didn't flinch, though her breath hissed once, sharp between her teeth. He watched from the corner of his eye, making sure she didn't pass out. She didn't. When she finished cleaning it, she reached for the small jar of bear grease he'd set near the salt. She worked it into the damaged skin with slow, steady fingers. Questions hung in the room like smoke. Why had she been chained? Who had sold her? Did she even understand what had happened back at the post? He thought about asking, then let it go. Words would come when they were ready, or they wouldn't. For now, survival came first. Heat, food, rest. That was the order he understood. He set a bowl of the hot stew in front of her once the beans had softened. He gave her a spoon and stepped back, giving her room. She ate with small, careful motions. Not like someone starved beyond reason, but like someone who had learned the hard way not to waste a single bite. He waited until she had finished half of her bowl before he took his own. They ate in silence. The only sound was the stove ticking as the iron cooled and settled. When she pushed the empty bowl toward the center of the table, he nodded once and set it aside. He went to a wooden crate near the wall, pulled out a gray wool blanket, and shook it open. "Fire will keep the room warm," he said. "You can sleep by the stove." He pointed to the corner where the floor was cleanest. Then he moved to the door and laid his own bedroll there, blocking the only way in or out. She watched him for a long time, her dark eyes unreadable in the flickering firelight. She looked at the blanket in her lap, and her shoulders eased just a fraction. She spread it near the hearth and laid down with her back to the wall, facing the room. Her breathing slowed, but her eyes stayed open, tracking his every movement as he checked the latch on the door and banked the fire low for the night. When he finally stretched out on his own bedroll, boots near the door, satchel within easy reach, the weight of the day pressed down on him. He stared at the dark ceiling boards and thought about the men who had laughed in that yard. He thought about the butcher reaching for his knife. He thought about how easy, how simple it would have been to just look away. He wondered if anyone would come riding after them. Fletcher had made a promise. He would be ready if they did. He'd given up his rifle years ago, a promise to himself. But a man didn't forget how to fight when the choice was clean. Across the room she lay still, but he knew she wasn't sleeping. Her thoughts were likely running like fast water under ice. She had expected pain tonight, maybe death. Instead, there was heat from a stove, food in her belly, and a man who had not touched her except to hand her a dipper of water. That probably unsettled her more than cruelty would have. Cruelty she knew. Cruelty was predictable. This quiet kindness felt like a trap, even when it didn't smell like one. She stared at the red glow in the stove door and kept her breathing quiet. If he wanted something, he would show it soon enough. She was ready for that. But he had not yet, and that made her wonder what kind of man this was. Outside, the wind dragged itself across the canyon, its mouth dry and hollow. Inside, the fire held. Two people lay in one small room, strangers tied together by a choice neither of them could take back. And the questions they carried filled the dark space between them like a third presence. Neither of them spoke the questions aloud. Not yet. The answers would have to wait for morning. Garrett woke suddenly, a hunter's instinct pulling him from a shallow, restless sleep. The cabin was dark, the only light a faint red glow from the banked coals in the stove. Outside, an owl called once, a lonely question that hung in the air, and then fell silent. He lay still, listening. Not to the wind, not to the old cabin groaning. He was listening for her breathing, and he couldn't hear it. She was gone. The blanket lay empty by the hearth. The chain, which he had finally unspooled from her arm and left coiled on the table, was still there. But she was gone. The door was unlatched but closed. He rose quietly, his movements silent as a shadow, pulling on his boots without lighting a lamp. She had every right to leave. He'd made no claim on her. But the night was cold, and there were coyotes in the wash. The door hinges protested with a soft groan as he stepped outside. Moonlight bathed the clearing in a wash of silver and black. The mule shifted in its lean-to, its eyes reflecting the faint light as it turned to look at him. No other movement caught his eye. Then he heard it, a sound rising from the edge of the clearing, where the land fell away into the deep shadows of the valley below. It was a low melodic sound. Not English, not Spanish, something older, with long, mournful vowels that seemed to bend and stretch toward the stars. She was standing at the edge of the drop-off, her silhouette tall and straight against the night sky. The torn dress hung loose around her shoulders, exposing the proud line of her neck and the strong curve of her back. Her arms were outstretched, her palms open to the moon as she sang. Garrett remained in the shadow of the cabin door. He did not move. He did not speak. This moment was not for him to interrupt. This was something private, something sacred. The song rose and fell like the wind through the canyon walls, a sound that belonged to this land long before men like him had ever come with their wagons and their ledgers and their chains. He didn't understand a single word, but he felt the weight of them. He felt the loss, the defiance, and something else, something underneath it all that might have been hope. When the last note faded into the vast, cold silence of the desert night, she lowered her arms slowly and turned. She looked directly at him, even though he stood deep in shadow. She had known he was there all along. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then she walked back toward the cabin, her stride steady and sure despite the cold ground. As she passed him in the doorway, her eyes met his. There was no apology in them, no explanation, just a quiet acknowledgement that he had witnessed something not meant for him. They returned to their places without speaking, the blanket by the stove, the bedroll by the door. But something had shifted in the small room, like the air right before a storm breaks. The questions that had been abstract before were now pressing hard against the walls. Who was this woman who sang to the moon in a language as old as the rocks? What people had lost her? And were they still searching? Garrett closed his eyes but didn't sleep. Across the room, the woman's breathing eventually deepened into real rest. The coals in the stove pulsed with a slow, steady heat, and the night stretched long and silent toward morning. The morning came with a cold, gray light that slid through the single smudged window. The fire had burned low, leaving a bed of red embers under a layer of soft ash. Garrett stirred awake first. Years of trail work and sleeping on hard ground had trained him to rise with the first shift in the air, in the quiet moment before a day truly begins. He rolled to his side, checked the latch on the door, then pushed himself up slowly, careful to keep the old floorboards from creaking. The shack was still, except for her breathing. It was steady now, deep with real sleep. She hadn't slept like that the night before. He could tell by the way she'd lain tense and rigid under the blanket. He let her sleep another half hour while he worked the stove back to life, setting dry kindling and striking a match. The sharp smell of smoke pushed the night's chill back toward the corners of the room. He set a kettle on and emptied the last of his coffee grounds into the pot. When she finally moved, it was cautiously at first, like someone testing to see if the roof was still overhead. Her eyes opened to the warm light of the fire instead of the cold iron of posts. Her body ached, her shoulder was stiff, and her hips were sore from the long walk. But the ache felt clean. It was nothing like the old familiar pain of chains biting into bone. She pushed herself up, the blanket sliding down her arm, and watched him as he poured coffee into a tin cup. He noticed her watching, but he didn't speak right away. He poured another cup, added a splash of water to cool it, and held it out to her. "Drink slow," he said. His voice was even, the same as yesterday with the same quiet weight that said, "This is routine, not a favor." She took the cup, her fingers curling tight around the warm tin, and sipped. It was bitter and strong, and it warmed her all the way down. Her eyes went to the length of chain still coiled on the table from last night. He saw her gaze land on it. Without a word, he picked it up and took it outside. She heard the scrape of metal on stone, then the sharp, repeated crack of a hammer on iron. He didn't bring it back inside. When he stepped through the door again, his hands were empty, except for a rag streaked black from soot. Breakfast was simple: corn mush and a slice of salt pork fried thin until it was crisp. He slid a plate across the table to her. She ate slowly, like before, now that the sharpest edge of her hunger was dulled. Her eyes lifted to his face, dark, steady eyes under the brim of a worn hat. The memory of yesterday was now clearer in the daylight. She studied him the way a hunter studies a map, quiet and measuring. Garrett spoke first this time, because some questions just couldn't sit unanswered forever. "What do they call you?" he asked. His tone was flat but not hard. Her jaw tightened for a moment. The words seemed to stick in her throat. Then she said it, her voice rough from disuse. "Aote." It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough. He nodded once. "Garrett," he said back, tapping his own chest. "Aote," she repeated, as if tasting the sound of her own name, letting it settle in this new room. She watched him for a long moment more. Then, like pulling a thorn out slowly, she asked a single word. "Why?" The word was careful, but the meaning was sharp as a shard of glass. "Why did you take me from that yard? Why didn't you leave me for the butcher's knife like the rest of them would have?" Garrett set his skillet aside and leaned his hands on the table. "Because they'd have cut you down like beef," he said. "And I couldn't stand by for that." He didn't dress it up. He didn't say any more than that. That was all he had to give, and it was all he meant. Her eyes didn't soften, but something in the set of her shoulders shifted. She either believed him or she desperately wanted to. She looked toward the door, then back at him. "You want payment?" Her tone was flat, not ashamed, just prepared for the world as she knew it. Garrett shook his head, one slow, deliberate time. "No. Your name is Auta. You're not property. You're not meat. You're here because it's better than the road behind us. That's all." He held her stare until he saw the tight line of her mouth ease just slightly. He stood and reached for the axe that leaned near the door. "Wood pile's low. Fire won't keep without more." He left the choice open for her. "You can stay inside where it's warm." He stepped out into the cold morning air and started splitting rounds of pine wood. The sound of the axe blade biting into the wood carried sharp and clean in the clear air. Inside, Iote sat still for a long moment. The room was warm now. The food sat heavy and good in her stomach. She looked at the shelf with its few plates, at the tools lined up in neat order near the door. Nothing in this small shack smelled of liquor or sickness. There was no rope hanging where it shouldn't be. She drew in a deep breath and let it out slowly. Then she stood, walked to the door, and stepped outside, barefoot, onto the cold, packed dirt. Garrett saw her shadow fall near the chopping block before he looked up. She reached for a second, smaller axe that was propped against the wall. Garrett almost told her no, but he stopped himself. He watched how she tested its weight, how she set her stance, how she drove the first cut clean and deep into the grain of the wood. She didn't speak. Neither did he. The rhythm of the work, the steady thud of two axes, settled between them like something older and more reliable than words. By mid-morning, the woodpile was waist-high. Her arms shone with sweat despite the cold. His shirt was stuck dark along his back. When they stopped, it wasn't because they were tired, but because the pile said enough. He poured water from the barrel and handed her the dipper. She drank, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, and sat on the stoop in the sliver of shade offered by the lean-to. The questions that had hung in the air after that first night had begun to fade, replaced by new, sharper ones. Who had sold her, and why? Would the men from the post, would Fletcher just let this go? Could he really keep her safe if they came back? He didn't speak those questions yet, but the way he now kept his rifle propped just inside the door, after 3 years of not even touching it, was its own kind of answer. Aote noticed. She said nothing. She only sat there, breathing in the dry wind, listening to the sound of her own heartbeat steadying. And for the first time in weeks, maybe months, she let herself believe that she might actually live to see another sunset. The days fell into a rhythm, like water finding its own level. Morning chores, the quiet work of midday, a shared evening meal. They worked on the small homestead without ever needing to discuss who would do what. Garrett repaired the sagging frame of the lean-to, while Iote, surprisingly skilled with her hands, found the small holes in the roof where winter snow might seep through and patched them with pitch and canvas. She wove new strands into an old worn-out broom. She used strips of rawhide to knit together the tiers in the leather of the water barrel. They spoke little, but the silence between them was changing its texture. It was less brittle now, less wary. It was becoming the comfortable quiet of two people who understood work and respected each other's space. At night, they kept to their places. Aode on her blanket near the warmth of the stove, Garrett on his bedroll by the door. He never moved closer. She never invited him to. Both of them understood that trust was still a thing under construction, as fragile as the first thin layer of ice on a creek. On the fourth night, Garrett returned from checking his trap lines to find Iote sitting at the table. The leather journal from his satchel was open in front of her. His body tensed, a quick, sharp reaction, but he kept his voice neutral as he set 3 rabbits on the counter. "Found my writing," he said. Iote didn't flinch. She didn't apologize. She met his eyes with the same direct, unwavering gaze she'd had since that first day. Then she did something that stopped him cold. "Lieutenant Morris Fletcher," she said, her English suddenly precise and perfectly clear. "23 dead at Bear Creek, no weapons found." She tapped a finger on the page. "You write his crimes." Garrett stood very still. The shock of hearing her speak perfect English was completely overtaken by the sudden, gut-wrenching realization of what she had read. His most private thoughts, his most damning evidence against Fletcher, all written down in his own hand. "You know him," he said. It wasn't a question. Oti nodded once. "The man from the post, the one who sold me." Her voice carried no tremor, just a cold, hard certainty. "He led the attack on our peace delegation 3 moons ago. My father was the second to our war chief. They killed him there." She closed the journal with careful, deliberate fingers. "You are not the only one with secrets, Garrett Hayes." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind pressed against the cabin walls, the only sound besides the quiet tick of the cooling stove. "You speak English well?" Garrett finally said, his voice rough. "I learned in the mission school as a child. Later, at a university in the East." Her gaze was steady, holding his. "I kept it hidden after I was captured. Men say more when they think you don't understand." Garrett pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily. "You're not Apache," he stated. "Hopi," she corrected him. "Daughter of War Chief Koto. I was with the delegation when Fletcher's men attacked. I alone survived." She touched the red X that was burned into her shoulder. "This is not a slave mark. This is Tutsi, the mark of the Pathkeeper." Her eyes held his, and he felt the weight of her next words before she even spoke them. "Among my people, I am the one who knows the hidden trails, the one who guards the way to the sacred places." Understanding dawned on him, slow and heavy. This was never just about one woman. "Fletcher wanted more than a sale price for you," he said. "He wanted the path to the gold in our mountains," she said simply. "He tried to make me speak. I did not. So he sold me for meat, thinking it would break me." Garrett leaned back in his chair. the weight of this new knowledge settling across his shoulders like a physical burden. This wasn't just a woman in chains. This was a war chief's daughter, a keeper of secrets, a guardian of her people's most sacred places. And somehow, impossibly, she was tied directly to his own quest for justice against Fletcher. "Why tell me this now?" he asked. Otey's gaze never wavered. "Because I read your words. Because you broke my chains. Because Fletcher knows you by name, and that means he will come for you too." She placed her hand flat on the cover of the journal. "You seek justice for Bear Creek. I seek justice for my father and our delegation. Our paths are now one." Garrett looked at this woman, no longer a stranger, but not yet an ally, and saw the same fierce determination that burned in his own chest. A deep, unyielding need to set right what had been so terribly broken. A need to hold accountable those who believed themselves to be beyond reach. "Fletcher will come," he agreed, his voice low. "But not tonight." He stood and moved to the counter, taking up his knife to skin the rabbits for their supper. Otey watched him work for a moment, then rose to fetch water for the pot. They prepared the meal in silence, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was the silence of two people planning a war. The wind shifted before noon the next day, carrying the dry tang of mesquite and something else, something sharper. The faint smell of smoke from a cook fire, too far off to see. Garrett noticed it when he set the axe down and wiped his forearm across his brow. His eyes scanned the distant ridges beyond the wash. No dust plume, no visible movement, but the smell told him someone was out there. He didn't mention it to her yet. There was no reason to lay that weight on her shoulders until he knew more. He just filed it away in his mind like a tally mark in a ledger. Stay sharp, keep the rifle ready. Inside the shack, the air was warmer, richer, with the smell of beans simmering on the stove. Ione was crouched near the hearth, turning a strip of salt pork in a skillet. She hadn't asked if she could cook. She had just started, the same way she had started splitting wood. He let her. A person needed work to feel steady, and he wasn't about to take that away from her. She moved with a quiet, sure grace, her hands working as if she had done this 1,000 times before, in 1,000 other places. Maybe for herself, maybe for people who didn't deserve the meal she made. Garrett stepped inside, set his rifle near the door without a word, and poured water from the kettle into 2 cups. He saw her eyes flick to the rifle, then to his face. He gave her nothing. No sign of worry, no hint that he had caught the scent of that distant smoke on the wind. She didn't ask, but the question sat in her posture, in the way her shoulders tensed for a breath longer than they should have before easing again. When they sat to eat, he watched how she handled her food. She wasn't guarded now, not measuring each bite as if she might be punished for taking too much. She was just calm, slow, as if she was letting her body remember what it felt like to be full. After a few minutes, she set her fork down and looked at him, her gaze straight and clear. "Men from the post," she said. They were not words shaped with care anymore, but with a hard-earned certainty. "They will come." Garrett chewed once, swallowed, and nodded. "Maybe," he said. He didn't sugar it. "Could be tomorrow, could be never, but I'll be ready." Her eyes held his, searching for the one thing that mattered most, the truth. He gave it to her, plain and unvarnished. "I don't hand people over. Not for money, not to avoid trouble. If they ride in here, they'll leave without you." The silence held for a long moment after that. Then she asked, "Why do you care?" It was the second time she had asked that question, but this time her voice carried more weight. Not anger, just the tired, aching confusion of someone who had been traded like a mule too many times to count. Garrett leaned back in his chair, resting his elbows on his knees. "Because I've seen what happens when a man looks away," he said. "A whole war was built on that." His eyes went distant for a breath, seeing gray fields and broken fences and bodies left for the crows. He pushed the picture back where it belonged and met her stare again. "I'm not looking away anymore." She studied him then, like a hunter studies tracks in the dirt. Then slowly, she nodded once. It was a small motion, but it held more than words. After they ate, he gathered the plates and she reached out to take them from him. Their fingers brushed. It wasn't on purpose, but it wasn't an accident either. She didn't pull her hand back, and neither did he. It was a short thing, gone as soon as it happened, but the air between them felt different after that. Not soft yet, just marked. The rest of the day settled into work. Garrett fixed the loose hinge on the cabin door, his hands steady even as his mind ticked through the angles of fire he'd have if riders showed up. Aote mended the tear in her dress with strips of rawhide, tying the front tight enough to hold. She had taken one of his old shirts to wear underneath it, the sleeves rolled up, the fabric stretched tight over her broad shoulders. It was too small for her, but she wore it like a piece of armor, and he didn't say a word about how the seams pulled taut across her chest. When the light began to drop behind the canyon rim, he brought in more wood, stacked it by the hearth, and checked the latch on the door again. Aote spread her blanket closer to the fire without being told. She didn't ask where he would sleep. She had seen that his bedroll was still by the door, his boots lying beside it. He wasn't moving any closer unless she said so, and he figured she knew that by now. As the night settled in, the unspoken questions from the first part of their story, the ones that had never been asked aloud, came back up in the shape of small, quiet things. Who was she before the chains? Would her people even take her back if she tried to return? Did she even want to? The way her eyes lingered on the dark window before turning back to the fire gave him one answer. There was nothing behind her worth walking back toward. Garrett poured the last of the coffee, handed her a cup, and let the quiet fill the room. No promises, no big talk, just the sound of the stove ticking and the wind slipping through the cracks in the walls. Trust wasn't spoken here. It was built in inches, in how close the blanket lay to the fire, in how the rifle leaned where they both could reach it, in how neither of them flinched anymore when the other one moved. Before he blew out the lamp, she asked him one more question, her voice low. "You will keep me safe." It wasn't a question anymore. It was a statement. He didn't blink. Yes. No oath, no ceremony, just a word said like a fact he had already carved into stone. She breathed out slowly, as if she had been holding that breath all day. Then she lay down with her back to the wall, her eyes closing, not from fear this time, but from a great and sudden weight. Garrett watched her for a beat longer, then banked the fire low and stretched out on his own bedroll. His hand rested near the satchel where the brass seal and the ledger sat, because if the law came knocking tomorrow, he would meet it head on. Sleep didn't come quick, but when it did, it was the first easy kind that either of them had tasted in a very long time. The first crack of sound came near dawn, a single hoofbeat carrying across the wash, then another, low and deliberate, the sound of men who wanted to be heard before they were seen. Garrett was already standing, having just kindled the morning fire. His face went flat, his hands loose at his sides. Aote had been sweeping ash from the stove. The broom stopped mid-stroke. Her eyes went to him first, then to the rifle propped by the doorframe. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She knew what that sound meant. Garrett stepped out onto the stoop. The rising sun hit him square, sharp enough to sting his eyes, but he kept his gaze locked on the rise beyond the scrub brush. 3 riders appeared, their shadows stretching long and distorted behind them before they came clear. It wasn't the law. It wasn't the military. It was just the kind of men who thought a horse and a gun bought them power in places without fences. The lead rider wore a dark vest stretched tight over a belly too round for hard work. Morris Fletcher gripped his reins like he owned everything he looked at. The man on his left had a scar that pulled his mouth into a permanent sneer. The last one was younger, with jumpy eyes and a hand that never strayed far from the butt of his Colt. Garrett stepped off the stoop slowly until he stood in the open, clear of the door. His rifle hung loose in his right hand, the barrel angled toward the dirt. Fletcher reined in about 10 yards out. His grin was wide and greasy, his tone easy. The kind of easy men use right before they start taking things. "Morn and Hayes," he called. "We come polite. Just here for the property. Don't belong to you." His eyes slid past Garrett, toward the dark doorway of the shack. Garrett didn't move a muscle. "No property here," he said, his voice carrying flat and dead across the open air. Fletcher chuckled. "Paper says otherwise. Sale was legal. Brand says so." Garrett raised the ledger in his left hand, the dull brass seal catching the morning sun like a gold coin. Federal freight custody, he said, the words practiced and hard. Filed and stamped. Means your sale won't stand in any court this side of Santa Fe. The sneer on the scarred man's face deepened. Ain't no court out here but what rides in on a horse, he said, his hand drifting closer to the iron at his hip. Garrett shifted the rifle. Not fast, just enough to make the worn wood of the stock catch the light. His eyes locked on the younger one, the twitchy one. If trouble started, it would come from him first. Garrett kept his voice dangerously calm. You don't want this, he said. Not over one woman you didn't give a damn about yesterday. Turn your horses and ride back. Tell the post you never saw her. Inside the shack, Aote stood by the table, her breath tight in her chest. She could hear every word, every hoof scrape in the dirt. Her eyes went to the pieces of the chain Garrett had flattened and thrown in a corner. She thought about picking one up, about what it would feel like to swing it if those men came through that door. She didn't feel fear, not the sharp, gutting kind. This was something colder, a readiness she hadn't tasted in years. Fletcher shifted in his saddle, spat a dark stream of tobacco juice into the dust, and tried a different tone. Softer, but with an edge like a rusted blade. You really think she's worth dying for, freight man? Garrett's jaw tightened. Not dying, he said, but I'll kill if you step 1 foot closer. The words landed like iron weights. There was no bluff in them, no brag, just the plain, simple truth laid bare. The men read it. They read it in the way he stood, his weight balanced, the rifle held like an old and familiar habit. They saw no tremor in his hand, no nervous tick in his jaw. The younger one's hand froze above his holster. The scarred man muttered something low and angry. Fletcher cursed under his breath. Then he jerked his reins hard. Hell with it, he said, turning his horse sharp enough to make the gravel spit. She ain't worth the blood. They rode off slowly at first because men like that don't like to look like they're being chased. Then faster once the ridge swallowed them from view. Dust hung in the sunlight long after their shapes were gone. Garrett watched until the last echo of their hoofbeats faded. Then he lowered the rifle, walked back inside, and set it carefully against the wall. His face stayed hard for another long breath before the sharp edges finally eased. Yote hadn't moved from her spot. Her hands were gripping the edge of the table so tight that the wood showed pale marks where her fingers had pressed. When he looked at her, she searched his eyes like a woman trying to decide what comes next. As if she was waiting for some price he'd waited to collect. Instead, he said only one thing. It's done. They won't be back. She didn't answer right away. Her throat worked, as if the words she wanted were stuck deep inside. Then she said, her voice quiet but steady, I believe you. 2 words, nothing more, but they felt heavy enough to change the air in the small room. She sat down then, slowly, as if her legs had forgotten how to hold her weight. Garrett poured a cup of water, set it in front of her, and left his hand there for a moment longer than he needed to. Not touching, just close. An offer she could take or leave. She looked at his hand, then at his face. And this time, her gaze didn't carry the old, guarded question of what he wanted from her. It carried something else. Something that looked a lot like trust. That night, when the stove glowed and the wind dropped low against the walls, Aote moved her blanket closer to the hearth. Garrett didn't ask. He just shifted his own bedroll the same distance closer to the fire, and the silence between them felt different now. Not empty, not cold, but like ground that was finally steady underfoot. The wind fell still by nightfall, leaving a deep hush that made the world outside feel too wide and the small shack feel too close. Garrett finished banking the fire and set the iron poker aside. He listened to the quiet tick of the stove as the heat settled into the steel. Ayotte was still by the wall, where she had pulled her blanket close to the hearth. She hadn't said much since the riders had turned back. Neither had he. There was nothing left to say about that fight. They had both seen what it meant. Garrett sat at the table for a long time after supper, running a cloth over the barrel of his rifle, checking the action, oiling the hinge. Not because it needed it, but because he needed his hands to be busy while his thoughts settled. He had told her they wouldn't be back. He believed it mostly, but he knew that men with that much pride had a way of circling back around like wolves when the wind shifted. He would be ready if they did. The question that was nagging at him now wasn't about them. It was about her. What did she want from here on out? Did she see this shack as a temporary stop or as an end to her journey? He wouldn't ask yet. You don't push someone who has spent years being pushed. When he finally set the rifle down, he turned to find her watching him. Not hard, not guarded, just watching, as if she had been weighing his every move since that day in the yard. Her face caught the lamplight in a way that made it plain how young she still was. Young and worn at the edges from too much hard road. She didn't look away when his eyes met hers. She held his stare for a long time before she spoke. You would have killed for me, she said. The words were flat, not a question, but heavy with something he couldn't quite read yet. I would have, he answered, if it had come to that. She blinked slowly, then asked, why? The question was sharper now. No more Fletcher now. No law to make you. Garrett leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. His voice stayed low, calm. Because I'm done watching wrong things happen when I can stop them. That's all. He waited for her to challenge it, to call it a lie. She didn't. She just sat there with her jaw set, as if she was filing that answer away deep inside her. Then after a long silence, she said a word he didn't expect. Safe. Her voice carried none of the hardness from before, just a raw, fragile edge, like something cracking under a great weight. She repeated it, softer this time. You are safe, he nodded once, as long as I'm breathing. The words were plain, but they landed heavy in the space between them. She drew in a breath that shuddered before it smoothed out, and for the first time since he had seen her chained to those posts, her body eased. It wasn't much, but it was enough for him to see it. Her shoulders dropped. The hands that had been curled tight all day opened on the blanket. She lay back on her side, facing the stove, her eyes half-lidded. But he knew she wasn't asleep. He knew the signs. He knew she was waiting, maybe for the world to turn hard on her again, maybe for something else entirely. Garrett unrolled his bed closer to the fire. Not too close, but close enough that if she woke up afraid in the dark, she wouldn't have to look very far. He stretched out and stared at the low roof beams until the lamplight dimmed, and then he blew it out. For a long time there was only the sound of the wind brushing against the cracks in the walls and the steady, quiet draw of two breaths in one room. He woke later, when the fire was low but not yet dead. He shifted, meaning to stoke it, and stopped. She was there, kneeling near his bedroll, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her hair loose and heavy in the faint fire glow. Her face was calm, but her eyes held something that wasn't fear anymore. Something chosen. You cold? He asked, his voice low and rough from sleep. She shook her head once. Not cold. Her hand came to rest on his chest. It was thin, but firm and certain. He could feel her feeling the steady beat of his heart under his ribs. She didn't move fast. Neither did he. He could have asked her what she wanted, but the answer was there in her eyes. And for once in his life, he didn't need any more words. Iode, he started, and she hushed him with the smallest shake of her head, as if to say that she didn't need talk. Not now. Not here. Garrett stayed still, letting her set the pace. Her breath hitched once when his arms slid under the blanket to her back, his fingers resting light against the curve of her spine. The heat that rose between them wasn't a quick fire, a sudden rush. It was slow and steady, something that felt earned after too much taking and not enough giving in both of their lives. She pressed her forehead to his jaw, like someone anchoring themselves against a strong current, and he held her there, not pulling, not pushing, just holding until the tremor in her breath finally faded away. When she finally lay down beside him, the blanket tangled around them both. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It felt like space that had been made solid, like a thing they could both stand on come morning. Morning broke without warning, just a gray wash of light sliding across the plank floor, the smoke curling soft from the stove's open throat. Garrett stirred first, the old habit of waking before the world. He lay still for a moment, listening. Her breathing was even, steady against his chest. The warmth of her body pressed along his side where she was curved under the blanket. The night replayed in his mind in quiet fragments. The weight of her hand on his chest, the way she had moved without fear, how neither of them had spoken, because words would have just made it smaller than what it was. He eased out of the bedroll slowly, so she wouldn't wake, his boots soft on the floor. The air bit cold as soon as the warmth of the blanket left him. He fed the stove, poured water into the kettle, and stepped outside to the trough. The ground crunched under his boots, a thin layer of frost covering the dirt, the kind that said winter would come hard and soon. The mule nickered low, its breath steaming in the cold air. Garrett rubbed its neck, his eyes scanning the ridge. No riders, no dust. Still, his eyes swept the horizon twice more before he went back inside. Ayotte was sitting up when he pushed the door shut, the blanket clutched around her shoulders, her dark hair spilling loose down her back. Her eyes followed him as he crossed the room. They were calm but with a new weight in them. Last night had changed something, and neither of them would be able to name it yet. She didn't look ashamed. She didn't look like someone waiting for blame. She looked like someone measuring what comes after a choice has been made. "Did you sleep?" he asked. She nodded once, better than in a long time. Her voice was rough from the morning and from lack of practice, but there was no edge in it now. He poured coffee, slid a cup toward her, and watched as she curled her hands around the warm tin like it held more than just heat. Her fingers were strong, scarred near the knuckles. They were hands that had worked, had fought, had maybe stolen to stay alive. He wondered what her life had been like before the chains. He wondered if she would ever tell him. She broke the silence first. "You kept your promise," she said, her eyes fixed on him over the rim of the cup. Garrett's jaw tightened, as if the memory of yesterday's standoff still had sharp corners. "I said I would." She studied him for another breath. "Then you still want me here?" It wasn't a soft question. It wasn't a plea. It was a hard-edged question, shaped by a life of being taken, not chosen. "Yes," he said, his voice steady as stone, "if you want to be here." Something eased in her shoulders at that, like a rope being cut clean. She didn't smile. Ayotte didn't seem like someone who had many smiles left in her, but her eyes held his, and for now that was enough. They ate their breakfast in a silence that was broken only by the scrape of their spoons. Afterwards she stood, pulled his old shirt tighter across her chest, and asked, "Work?" The word came out clipped, as if she needed her hands to be busy before her head filled up with things that were too heavy to hold. Garrett nodded. "The roof needs more patching before the snow hits." The day stretched long and quiet. They worked side by side, he on the lean-to, the hammer steady in his hand. She hauling shingles up a ladder like they weighed nothing, balanced and sure-footed despite the wind that tugged her hair loose. He found himself watching her more than once, not with hunger, but with the slow, quiet respect of a man seeing strength where the world had only seen ruin. By late afternoon, the patch was tight, the seams tarred against the rain. They stacked wood until the pile was higher than his waist, enough to last them through the first freeze. As dusk began to press in, out he washed by the trough, pouring water from a tin dipper over her arms and face, her breath misting in the cooling air. Garrett turned away at first, out of habit, but then he looked back when he heard her laugh. It was soft and quick, like a sound she didn't mean to let loose. It hit him harder than he had expected. He hadn't heard that kind of sound in years, maybe ever. Inside, the shack smelled of smoke and iron. He set the rifle on the table and checked the latch twice. When he turned, she was standing near the stove, her hair damp, wearing the mended dress over his shirt. It hung open at the throat where the rawhide tie had loosened. She didn't fix it, and she didn't move when he stepped closer. He stopped just an arm's length from her and said, "You're tired. Eat first." The words were simple, plain. The words of a man who knew what taking felt like and wanted no part of it. They ate slowly, steadily. Afterwards, she rose without a sound and spread her blanket closer to his bedroll than it had been the night before. When she lay down, her back brushed against his arm. He didn't move. Neither did she. The silence said enough. It wasn't empty now. It wasn't brittle. It was just full. Like the space between two people who had walked a long way through the dark and were finally starting, piece by piece, to believe in the light again. The days turned into weeks. A hard frost painted the ground each morning now, delicate white lines that vanished with the sun's rise, only to return the next dawn. Garrett and Ioti fell into the rhythm of a shared life. It wasn't easy, but it was steady. Work, food, rest, words when they were needed, and silence when they were not. Each day she revealed a little bit more of herself. Small things. The fact that she could not only speak English, but could read and write it as well as he could. The way she knew which plants growing in the wash would heal a fever and which would just make you sick. The quiet songs she sometimes hummed when she thought he couldn't hear. In turn, Garrett slowly began to unwind the hard knots of his own history. He told her how he had been a scout for the Union, how he'd seen enough death to last 10 lifetimes, how he had failed to stop the massacre at Bear Creek, and how the rough hemp of the rope had felt around his neck when his own men had decided he was a traitor for trying. The scar, Ayotte said one evening, her fingers hovering near but not quite touching the puckered line that circled his throat. From them, Garrett nodded once. The rope was old. It broke on the drop. A colonel named Warren cut me down after, told me to ride and never look back. Why did you not die? She asked. There was no softness in the question, just an honest, blunt curiosity. Don't know, he answered. Guess I wasn't done yet. They sat with that for a long time, the fire crackling between them. Two people marked by violence, but not broken by it. Two souls carrying scars, his around his neck, hers burned into her shoulder. Both of them constant reminders of a world that had tried to end them and had failed. The mark, Garrett said, his eyes on the red X that was visible at the edge of her collar. What does it mean? Pathkeeper, you said. Oat was quiet for a long time, weighing something in her mind. Then the decision made, she spoke more words at once than he had ever heard from her before. Among my people, the one who knows the sacred trails bears this mark, the one who can guide us to the holy places, to the hidden water springs, to safety in times of war. She touched the burn lightly with her fingertips. My grandmother was the path keeper before me. She taught me the ways before she died, the trails that no white man has ever walked, the canyons where the spirits of our ancestors dwell. Her eyes lifted to his, serious and measuring. Fletcher learned what I was. He wanted the paths to our mountains. Her voice hardened. Gold lies beneath our sacred hills. He thought if he owned me, he owned the gold. The final piece clicked into place. That's why he came back, Garrett said. Not just for you, for what you know. She nodded once, a sharp, angry movement. He will come again, when he has more men, when he thinks you have lowered your guard. Garrett absorbed this, the heavy implications settling like stones in water. This wasn't just about one woman's freedom anymore. It was about greed, about land, about the same bloody business that had been playing out across the West for decades. Then we prepare, he said simply. Over the next few days, that's exactly what they did. Garrett oiled his rifle, carefully checking his ammunition, and reinforced the hinges on the door. Ayotte set traps in the narrow approach to the cabin. Nothing lethal, just warnings. Tripwires made of sinew, tied to tin cans that would rattle. Piles of brush arranged to funnel any riders into places where they would be clearly visible from the cabin. They didn't speak of what would happen if, or when, Fletcher returned with more men. They didn't need to. The preparation itself was its own kind of language, a shared commitment to what they were building here. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something more enduring. At night, they no longer slept separately. Ote's blanket joined Garrett's bedroll, creating a shared space of warmth near the stove. They would lie together, her back pressed against his chest, his arm draped over her waist. They weren't lovers in the usual sense of the word. There was too much weight, too much history between them for that simple word to fit. But something deeper was growing, a bond forged in the crucible of shared danger and mutual respect. One night, as the wind rattled the shutters and the first real snow began to fall in earnest, Ote turned in his arms to face him. Her eyes caught the firelight, turning them amber and gold against her dark skin. Why did you never ask about my people? She said, if I wanted to return. Garrett considered this. Figured you'd say if you wanted to. She studied his face, reading the truth there. My people believe I am dead. Fletcher told them so. He said he saw me fall at the Peace Council. You could go back, Garrett said. Show them he was a liar. She shook her head once. Not yet. Not while Fletcher lives. My father's spirit cannot rest while his killer walks free. Her hand found his, her fingers intertwining with his. And I am not ready to leave this place. The words hung between them, weighted with meaning. This place, this cabin, this man. Then stay, Garrett said. It was as simple as that. She nodded, a decision that had already been made. I stay. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in a silent, clean white. Inside, the fire crackled, pushing back the darkness. Two people who had lost everything were starting to find that they were building something new from the ashes of their past. Not safety, not exactly, not in a world where men like Fletcher still existed, but something just as precious. A home. The snow deepened day by day, and then week by week. Winter laid its hand heavy on the canyon lands. The path to Crow's Landing disappeared under deep white drifts, cutting them off completely from the settlement. They did not mind the isolation. The woodpile was high, and the small storeroom was stocked with smoked meat and dried corn. Garrett had planned for winter long before it had arrived, and Aote's knowledge of wild plants had added edible roots and dried berries to their stores. In the quiet of those snowbound days, they began to speak more. Words that had been rationed before now flowed more easily. Aote told him stories of her childhood in the high mesas, of ceremonies held under the stars, of her time at the Eastern University where the white teachers had tried to erase her language from her tongue. Garrett, in turn, shared memories of his own. A farm in Pennsylvania, the brothers he had lost to the war, the strange, quiet peace he had found in these canyon lands after years of wandering. They were mapping each other, slowly and carefully, the way travelers chart unknown territory, finding the safe passages, the dangerous cliffs, and the unexpected valleys of beauty. One morning, Garrett woke to find Aote already up, standing by the window. The snow was falling in thick, heavy curtains outside, the world beyond the glass a blur of white. She stood very still, one hand pressed to her stomach, her face unreadable. He rose, pulled on his shirt, and moved to stand beside her, not touching, just present. Something wrong? He asked. She shook her head slowly. Not wrong. Her hand stayed on her belly, pressing a little firmer now. Life, she said. Here, inside. The words took a moment to penetrate the morning quiet. When they did, Garrett felt something shift deep in his chest, like a stone dislodging after years of being wedged tight. A child? He asked, his voice rough with sleep and something else. Something that might have been wonder. Aude turned to face him then, her eyes searching his for a reaction. Yes, from before. From my people. She placed her palm flat against her stomach. My beloved died at the Peace Council. This is all that remains of him. Garrett absorbed this. Not his child, the child of a man who had died at Fletcher's hands, a man Ayotte had loved. How long have you known? He asked. Since before the chains, she said. I hid it. If they had known, they would have sold me differently. Not for meat, for service. Her eyes held his, challenging him. Does it change things? Garrett looked at her. At the woman who had split wood beside him, who had mended his roof, who had trusted him with her body, and now with this secret. He shook his head once, a firm, definite movement. No, he said, it changes nothing. A flicker of relief crossed her face, there and then gone. She had been preparing herself for rejection, for anger, for the end of the fragile thing they had built. Instead, she had found acceptance. It settled over her like a warm blanket. The child will come with the spring, she said, when the snow melts, when the world grows green again. Garrett nodded, the timing making a strange kind of sense. 5 months, maybe 6, before a new life would join them in this small cabin. He found himself mentally calculating what they would need. A cradle, softer blankets, more food stores. We'll be ready, he said. Aote's hand found his, her fingers intertwining with his. And for the first time since he had known her, she smiled. Not just the small quirk of her lips he had seen before, but a real, true smile that reached her eyes. It transformed her face, erasing years of hardship in an instant. She repeated, testing the word, finding it good. Outside, the snow continued to fall, burying the world. Inside, something new had taken root, fragile but determined. A future that neither of them had dared to imagine now stretched out before them, uncertain but full of possibility. The thaw came slowly, breaking winter's hold one day at a time. By early March, the snow had drawn back to the shadowed edges of the wash, leaving the ground dark and soft underfoot. Water trickled where dry dirt had baked all summer, a thin, promising thread that meant the grass would rise again. Garrett stood outside at dawn, his coat open against the lingering cold, watching the sun burn the frost off the mule's back. Behind him, smoke climbed in a steady straight line from the stovepipe. Inside, the shack smelled of coffee and firewood, and something he hadn't known he would miss if it were gone. A warmth that came from more than just heat. Ote moved through the room with a quiet calm that hadn't been there in the first weeks. Her steps were silent, not because she was hiding anymore, but because the habit of silence still clung to her like old dust. She set a bowl on the table and rested a hand against her belly as she straightened. It was more than just a curve now, a definite roundness under his borrowed shirt. Garrett had noticed how she was slowing on the ladder, the way she sat for longer by the fire at night. He had said nothing, letting her set the pace of her own pregnancy, respecting her deep knowledge of her own body. Now she turned, met his eyes, and smiled that rare, transformative smile. It still caught him off guard every single time. How it changed her from a warrior into something softer, if only for a moment. For a long moment, Garrett didn't move. Not because he doubted her, but because something deep inside him, something that had been hard and rusted for years, suddenly cracked open all at once. He stepped forward slowly, the old boards creaking under his boots, and laid his hand over hers on her belly. Warm, he said. Solid. Real. She nodded once, and the breath he let out felt like a weight he had carried since the war was finally sliding free. He didn't speak at first. He just wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight against him. And for the first time in years, he let his head bow and his eyes close without any shame. When he pulled back, his jaw was set with something new. Not hardness, not the old sharp edge of a man who expects the world to burn down around him. It was steadiness. The kind of steadiness that builds when a man knows exactly what his life is for. Then we do this right, he said, his voice low but sure. You want words said proper? We can ride to a preacher. You want to swear it under this roof? I'll stand in front of that stove and say what matters. Ote's eyes flicked to the small shelf he had built for her months ago, where she had placed her few treasures. A string of beads dulled with time, a piece of bone carved smooth, a strip of cloth worn thin at the edges. Small things that carried the weight of her past. Here, she said firmly, our way. So that night, with the wind moving soft through the cracks in the walls and the stove throwing a warm glow against the wood, they stood facing each other in the small space they had made with their own hands. No crowd, no paper. Just two voices speaking truths as plain and solid as iron. To stay, to keep, to fight if they had to, and to never ever look away again. When it was done, he kissed her, the way a man does when there is no fear left, only promise. She kissed him back like someone who had waited too long for a life she could finally call her own. The questions that had haunted every single mile of this story: would she be free, or would she be traded again? Would he hold firm when the fight came? Could two broken people really build something worth keeping? All of them found their answers in that room. The ledger lay shut on the shelf. The chain lay broken and buried in the dirt where he had left it. In its place stood a life carved from silence, made solid by choice. The morning it happened started like any other. Garrett was out checking his trap lines. Aote was hanging laundry, her belly now a proud, round curve beneath her dress. The air was warm with the promise of spring. She heard them first. The sound of hooves, multiple riders moving slowly and deliberately through the narrow approach to the cabin. The telltale jingle of metal, bridles, spurs, guns. Aote dropped the wet shirt she was hanging and moved quickly, without panic, to the cabin. Inside, she took Garrett's rifle from its place by the door, checked the load with practiced hands, and positioned herself at the window. The tripwires she had set would have alerted them to any casual visitors. These men had cut them. They weren't casual travelers then. They were men who knew what they were doing, men who had scouted the approach. She counted 6 riders as they emerged from the tree line. Fletcher was in the lead, his fat belly straining against a button vest. The scarred man and the young twitchy one were with him, and 3 others she didn't recognize. Hard-faced men with the dead-eyed look of hired guns. A cold, sharp calm settled over Aota. The warrior's focus her father had taught her. Her hand did not tremble on the rifle. Her breathing remained steady. Only the child within her shifted, as if sensing her tension. Fletcher reined in about 20 yards from the cabin. His eyes swept the clearing, lingering on the empty clothesline, the half-hung shirt. "Hayes!" he called, his voice carrying across the yard. "Come on out and talk. No need for trouble today." Oat remained silent, the rifle ready. Garrett was due back any time now. She only needed to hold them off until then, but something in Fletcher's easy, smug confidence made her stomach knot with a cold dread. "I know you're in there, woman," Fletcher called after a moment of silence. "And your man isn't coming back. We found him up at the North Ridge. Saved you the trouble of digging a grave." Out's heart stuttered, but her face remained a mask of stone. A lie. It had to be a lie. Garrett was too careful, too skilled to be taken by surprise. "We can do this easy," Fletcher continued, his voice taking on a persuasive, slimy tone. "You come on out, show us the trails to the gold, and we let you go. Simple as that. Or we burn this place to the ground with you in it. Your choice." Aote weighed her options. 6 armed men against 1 woman, heavy with child. If they were telling the truth about Garrett, no, she wouldn't believe it. Not until she saw proof. She needed time. Time for Garrett to return. Time to formulate a plan. Making her decision, she moved to the door, the rifle still in her hand. She pushed it open with her foot and stepped out onto the porch, keeping the weapon aimed squarely at Fletcher's chest. "No trails," she said, her English clear and precise, surprising the men who had expected broken speech. "No gold. Leave now." Fletcher's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. Then he laughed, a sound like stones grinding together. "Well, well, the savage speaks proper after all." He leaned forward in his saddle. "Listen good. I know what that mark on your shoulder means. I know you're the pathkeeper, and you will show us the way, or you'll die right here." Oates' finger tensed on the trigger. 1 shot. She could take Fletcher, at least, before the others cut her down. But the child would die with her. "The gold is not yours to take," she said, playing for time. "It belongs to the earth, to the ancestors. It is sacred." "Sacred don't feed hungry men," Fletcher spat. "Sacred don't build railroads. Progress is coming, woman. You can either profit from it or be crushed beneath it." The scarred man shifted impatiently. "Enough talk, Morris. She ain't cooperating. Let's just burn the place and be done with it." Fletcher held up a hand. "One more chance," he said to Aote. "Come with us, peaceful-like. Show us the trails and you live. Simple as that." Aote stood very still, the rifle steady. The child kicked inside her, strong and insistent. A life that deserved a future. A life that was a part of her beloved. A part of her people. "I choose life," she said finally. Fletcher smiled, victory glinting in his greedy eyes. "Smart woman. Come on down slow now. No sudden moves." Aote took 1 step forward, then another. The rifle didn't waver. "I choose life," she repeated, her voice ringing with a cold fire. "But not yours." Her finger tightened on the trigger. In that exact instant, a single shot rang out from the ridge behind the cabin. It wasn't from her rifle. It was from somewhere up in the rocks. One of Fletcher's men jerked in his saddle, clutching at his shoulder, blood seeping out between his fingers. A second shot followed immediately, and another man's hat flew off his head. "Ambush!" the scarred man shouted, drawing his pistol. Fletcher's head swiveled, his face turning a blotchy red as he searched for the source of the shots. "Hayes! Show yourself, you coward!" More shots rang out, but not from one direction. They came from 3 different points around the clearing. They were methodical, precise. the work of multiple shooters. Ioti felt a surge of hope in her chest. Not Garrett, her people. They had come. The men were in disarray now, their horses dancing nervously under them, their guns drawn, but with no clear target. Fletcher's face was twisted with rage. "Fall back!" he shouted. "To the trees!" As they retreated, a lone figure emerged from the rocks behind the cabin. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a rifle raised to his shoulder. It wasn't Garrett. It was a Hopi warrior in traditional dress, his hair bound with a red band, his face painted for battle. "Swift Hawk," Aote breathed, recognizing her brother. More warriors appeared, materializing from the rocks and the trees as if they had been born from the land itself. 7 of them, then 10, then 15. They had been there all along, watching, waiting for the right moment. Fletcher and his men had reached the tree line, taking cover behind trunks and boulders. The scarred man was firing wildly, his shots going wide. "You are surrounded, Fletcher," Swifthawk called out, his English perfect. "Drop your weapons or die where you stand." Fletcher's face was contorted with hatred. "This is American territory. You have no authority here." "This is Hopi land," Swifthawk replied calmly, "and you are a trespasser. You who killed our peace delegation. You who took my sister and sold her like meat." Understanding dawned on Fletcher's face as he looked from Swifthawk to Aodi. "Sister," he spat. "A whole tribe of savages." A new voice cut through the standoff, familiar and steady as the earth itself. "Drop the gun, Fletcher." "Ananin." Garrett stepped into the clearing from the eastern approach, his rifle aimed squarely at Fletcher's chest. He moved with a quiet purpose. There was no limp, no blood. He was very much alive. Oat felt a wave of relief wash through her, so strong it nearly buckled her knees. The lie revealed. Garrett alive. Her people here. The child safe within her. Fletcher's eyes darted between Garrett, Aote, and the Hopi warriors that surrounded them. Calculation played across his face, followed by the cold, hard realization that he was outmatched. "This isn't over, Hayes," he growled, but his gun hand lowered slightly. "It is for you," Garrett said. "The massacre at Bear Creek, the attack on the peace delegation, the slave trading. It all ends today." Fletcher sneered. "You got nothing on me, Hayes. No proof that would stand in any white man's court." "Don't need a white man's court," Garrett replied. "I've got my journal. I've got witnesses. And I've got Colonel Warren at Fort Benson, who's been looking for you ever since Bear Creek." For the first time, a flicker of real uncertainty showed in Fletcher's eyes. Colonel Warren. That name meant something to him. "Your choice," Garrett continued. "Surrender to the Hopi and face their justice, or come with me to Fort Benson and face the armies. Either way, you answer for what you've done." Fletcher looked at his men. The wounded one was bleeding badly, the others wide-eyed with fear. The scarred man met his gaze and gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Not worth dying for." Slowly, Fletcher lowered his pistol all the way. "I'll take the fort," he said through gritted teeth. Swifthawk stepped forward, gesturing to his warriors. They moved in silently, collecting the weapons from Fletcher and his men, binding their hands with leather straps. Garrett crossed the clearing to Ayote, his eyes never leaving her face. When he reached her, his hand came up to touch her cheek, a gesture so gentle it made her throat tighten. "You're alive," she said, the words barely a whisper. "Told you I'd keep you safe," he replied, "as long as I'm breathing." She leaned into his touch, allowing herself that one moment of vulnerability before turning to face her brother. Swifthawk approached slowly, his eyes taking in her rounded belly, her hand now intertwined with Garrett's. "Sister," he said in Hopi, "we thought you were dead." "I almost was," she replied in the same tongue. "This man saved me." Swifthawk looked at Garrett then, measuring him with the same steady gaze Aote herself had used when they first met. "You took my sister from chains." "She was never property to take," Garrett said. "She was always free. I just helped her remember it." Swifthawk nodded, something like respect flickering in his eyes. "Our people wait in the high canyon. They will rejoice to see you are alive." He glanced at her belly. "And to see that new life is coming." Aote felt the weight of that moment. Her people, her brother, the life she had left behind. And beside her, Garrett, the cabin they had built together, the life they had forged from broken pieces. I will come, she said to Swifthawk, to see them, to let them see me. Her hand tightened around Garrett's. But my home is here now. My path is with him. Swifthawk studied them both for a long moment, then nodded once, accepting her choice. Then he is family too. The words settled over them like a blessing. Family. Something neither of them had truly possessed for a very long time. As Fletcher and his men were led away, Aote turned to Garrett, her eyes full of questions. How did they find us? My people? Garrett's mouth quirked in a half smile. They've been watching all along, since the first week. I spotted their signs, but I kept quiet. I figured they were making sure you were safe. He looked at Swifthawk. They were waiting to see what kind of man had taken you. Swifthawk inclined his head. We judge you by your actions, not your words. You passed the test. Odie felt a wave of understanding dawn on her. She had never been truly alone. Her people had been watching over her, giving her the space to choose her own path, but ready to intervene if she ever needed them. She placed her hand on her belly, feeling the child shift within her. Then the path ahead is clear, she said. Garrett nodded, his hand covering hers. Clear as it can be in this world. Behind them, the small cabin stood solid against the bright spring sky. Before them, a future that neither of them could have imagined 6 months ago stretched out like an unwritten page. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be certain, but it would be theirs to write together. Spring brought green up the wash, and with it, work. Garrett built a second corral, his hands raw from the plane, and Iote stitched clothes small enough to fit in the palm of her hand. They ate on the stoop when the air turned warm, and sometimes when the sky burned red at dusk, she would laugh, a low sound under her breath that had become as steady and as natural as the wind through the mesquite. By summer, the sound of a child's cry had joined it, and for the first time in years, Garrett Hayes looked at the life he had built and believed that what he was seeing was not just a borrowed moment, not just something the world could take away from him. It was home. It would hold, and no man alive would ever tear it loose. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more tales of survival and justice from the strange and forgotten corners of history.